Ladies and gentlemen, in the world of crime, death is supposed to be final. Once a person is declared dead, files are closed, families mourn, and the system moves on. But every once in a while, a case emerges that forces us to question how fragile truth really is. This is the story of a man who was officially declared dead, until a single piece of CCTV footage proved that the system had buried him alive, at least on paper. The story begins with a man whose life slowly slipped into uncertainty long before he was ever declared dead. He wasn't a criminal mastermind or a fugitive living on the edge of society. He was ordinary, someone with routines, responsibilities, and people who expected to see him every day. That ordinariness is what made his disappearance so unsettling. When he didn't show up for work, when his phone went unanswered, when days turned into weeks with no contact, concern began to grow. At first, people assumed something simple. Maybe he needed space, maybe he had left town, maybe there was a misunderstanding. But silence has a way of changing meanings over time, and eventually, that silence became suspicious. Authorities were notified, and an investigation began, but from the very start, it lacked urgency. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood, no witnesses reporting a struggle. His home looked untouched, his belongings mostly in place. To investigators, this absence of chaos suggested a voluntary disappearance or an accident rather than a crime. That assumption quietly shaped everything that followed. Leads were minimal, tips were vague, and without physical evidence, the case drifted into a gray area where certainty was impossible and motivation was unclear. As time passed, speculation filled the gaps left by facts. Some believed he had met with foul play and his body simply hadn't been found. Others suggested he had walked away from his life intentionally. Rumors circulated, theories formed, but none of them brought answers. In the absence of proof, the system leaned toward probability rather than possibility. And probability, in many cases like this, ends with a declaration of death. Legally declaring someone dead without a body is a heavy decision, but it happens more often than people realize. After a certain amount of time, especially when a person has no financial activity, no communication, and no confirmed sightings, the law allows for a presumption of death. In his case, that threshold was crossed quietly. Paperwork replaced investigation. His name was added to a list of those presumed lost forever. From the system's perspective, the matter was settled. But what makes this moment chilling is not just that he was declared dead, it's how easily that declaration erased him. Once labeled deceased, resources stopped flowing. Searches slowed, then stopped entirely. His case was archived, no longer active, no longer urgent. To the outside world, he no longer existed. The law had spoken, and the law said he was gone. For his family, the declaration was devastating in a different way. Grief without certainty is its own kind of torture. There was no body to bury, no final goodbye, only an official statement telling them to accept a reality they could not fully understand. Some clung to hope, others surrendered to despair, but all were forced to live with unanswered questions. Was he scared? Was he suffering? Was he already dead when they stopped looking, or was he still alive somewhere, waiting to be found? What no one considered seriously enough was the possibility that the system itself was wrong. That the assumptions guiding the investigation had blinded it to alternative truths. Declaring someone dead is meant to bring closure, but in this case, it did the opposite. It sealed the truth behind bureaucracy. The most terrifying part of this keynote is not the disappearance itself, but how quickly a living person can be written off when certainty is inconvenient. A man vanished, the system made a decision, and reality was reshaped by paperwork rather than proof. What no one knew at the time was that this declaration of death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much darker question. What happens when the state is wrong, and the dead are not actually dead at all? What the system failed to account for was the uncomfortable truth that absence does not equal death. While paperwork closed his case, the world itself kept moving, and somewhere within that movement, traces of him still existed. The second keynote of this story lives in that blind spot, the space between what authorities believed and what reality quietly preserved. It is here that the narrative shifts from disappearance to deception, not necessarily by the man himself, but by circumstance, assumption, and human error. In the weeks and months after he was declared dead, subtle anomalies began to surface, though no one was actively looking for them. Small inconsistencies appeared in timelines, unexplained gaps that never quite made sense. A utility bill showed unusual activity before abruptly stopping. A bank inquiry was logged and then dismissed as a system error. These moments were individually insignificant, easily explained away in isolation. But together, they formed a faint trail, one that went unnoticed because the conclusion had already been reached. This is where crime stories often turn tragic, when conclusions come before truth. Once someone is presumed dead, every new piece of information is filtered through that assumption. Investigators no longer ask, "Where is he?" They ask, "What happened to him?" That shift in thinking closes doors. Tips are deprioritized. Sightings are brushed off as mistaken identity. Even credible information can be ignored if it contradicts the official narrative. In this case, that mindset became the greatest obstacle to uncovering the truth. There were reports, quiet ones, uncertain ones. Someone claimed to have seen a man who looked just like him near a transit hub. Another mentioned a familiar face in a convenience store, staring too long at a security monitor. These accounts never reached the level of action because they conflicted with the declared outcome. The man was dead, according to the system. Therefore, the sightings had to be wrong. That logic, repeated enough times, became accepted reality. What makes this keynote disturbing is how easily a living person can be erased by procedure. Without an active investigation, there was no mechanism to verify or falsify these anomalies. No one cross-checked faces, no one reviewed footage, no one followed up on whispers. The infrastructure designed to find missing people had already moved on. His existence had become a closed file, and closed files do not speak. Psychologically, this phase of the story reflects a dangerous human tendency, the comfort of finality. Declaring him dead allowed everyone involved to move forward. Investigators cleared a case, institutions closed accounts, and the world adjusted. But that comfort came at a cost. It replaced curiosity with certainty, and in doing so, it allowed the truth to hide in plain sight. At the same time, the man himself, wherever he was, became a ghost in the truest sense. If he was alive, he existed outside the system entirely. No legal identity, no recognized presence, no protection. A person in that state is vulnerable, invisible, and easily overlooked. Whether he was hiding, trapped, or simply unable to return, the declaration of death stripped him of the ability to be found. Not every mystery is solved by evidence, some are buried by conclusions. The system believed it had an answer, and because of that belief, it stopped asking questions. The tragedy is not just that he vanished, but that the possibility of his survival was dismissed long before it was disproven. And this is what makes the story so chilling: the truth did not disappear. It waited, patient, unnoticed, while everyone else accepted a lie that felt easier than uncertainty. When technology, not human intuition, disrupts the official narrative. This is where the story pivots from assumption to exposure, from paperwork to proof. After months, possibly years, of silence, it wasn't a confession, a witness, or a recovered body that reopened the case. It was a camera, cold, objective, and unforgiving. CCTV did what the system failed to do: it saw him. The footage surfaced accidentally, buried within hours of recordings from a location that had nothing to do with the original investigation. A routine review, a compliance check, a technician scanning timelines without context. And then, there he was. Not as a shadow or a blur, but as a living, moving presence. Walking, pausing, turning his head, alive in a way that no theory could dispute. In a single frame, the declaration of death collapsed. What makes this moment so powerful in crime storytelling is its purity. CCTV does not speculate. It does not assume. It records. And what it recorded contradicted everything that had been officially accepted as truth. A man declared dead was breathing, blinking, existing. The system had erased him, but the lens had preserved him. The impact of that footage was immediate and destabilizing. Investigators were forced into a position they rarely face, admitting that the conclusion came too early. That an entire chain of decisions, closed files, dismissed leads, ignored sightings, had been built on an unverified assumption. The camera didn't just reveal a living man, it exposed institutional failure. But the footage raised more questions than answers. Why was he there? Why had he not come forward? Was he hiding, or had he been unable to return? Was this survival, or captivity? Crime stories thrive in this uncertainty, and here it was absolute. The footage proved life, but not freedom. Existence, but not safety. There was also a chilling detail investigators couldn't ignore: his behavior. He didn't move like someone living openly. His posture was guarded, his pauses deliberate. He scanned his surroundings with the awareness of someone who knew being seen was dangerous. This was not a man resurrected by chance. This was someone surviving under pressure, possibly fear. CCTV, often seen as passive background noise in urban life, became the most important witness in the case. It succeeded where interviews failed, where reports stalled, where assumptions hardened. It caught a truth that had been walking through public space while the system insisted it no longer existed. That contradiction is what makes this keynote so unsettling. From a crime perspective, this moment redefines the role of evidence. It proves that truth does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits in archives, in forgotten hard drives, in footage no one thinks to review because the case is over. The danger lies not in lack of technology, but in lack of curiosity. How fragile identity becomes once death is declared. Legally, socially, procedurally, he was gone. The camera gave him back his existence, but it also placed him at the center of a new threat. Now that he was seen, the clock restarted. Someone knew. Something had been interrupted. In crime stories, resurrection is never comforting. It is a warning. And in this case, the footage wasn't just proof of life, it was proof that the truth had been watching the entire time, waiting for someone to notice. In the aftermath of revelation, where survival becomes more dangerous than disappearance. Once the footage surfaced and the truth could no longer be denied, the case didn't move toward relief, it moved toward escalation. Because in the world of crime, being found alive after being declared dead doesn't mean safety. It means exposure. The moment investigators confirmed the authenticity of the CCTV footage, everything changed. A man officially recorded as deceased was now walking through public space, which meant someone had made a mistake, or someone had manipulated the system. Both possibilities were equally terrifying. Either negligence had erased a living person, or his death had been engineered for a reason. And in crime stories, engineered deaths are never accidental. Law enforcement now faced a race against time. If he was alive, someone else knew it too. The same cameras that saw him could have been seen by others. The same trail that led investigators to him could lead someone else straight to him. The question was no longer is he alive, but how long will he stay that way? What followed was a quiet but intense operation. Surveillance was tightened. Digital records were re-examined. Financial footprints, phone metadata, travel patterns, everything was pulled apart again, this time with urgency. But the man himself remained unreachable. No direct contact. No confirmation of safety. Just fragments of movement caught by lenses that couldn't speak to him, couldn't warn him, couldn't protect him. This is where the psychological weight of the case becomes crushing. Imagine being alive while the world believes you are dead, and then realizing the lie has been exposed. Every step becomes dangerous. Every public appearance a risk. If his disappearance was intentional, then being seen could undo whatever protection that false death provided. If it wasn't intentional, then his survival had already placed him in someone's crosshairs once before. Investigators also had to confront a disturbing possibility. What if the declaration of death wasn't a mistake, but a message? In some criminal networks, erasing someone officially is cleaner than killing them. It removes obligation, scrutiny, and search efforts. A living ghost is easier to control than a missing body. And if that were the case, then the CCTV footage hadn't just exposed life, it had disrupted a plan. The tension in this keynote lies in what didn't happen next. There was no immediate rescue. No public reunion. No dramatic confrontation. Instead, silence stretched. Days passed. Then weeks. The man did not reappear on camera. Almost as if he knew he had been seen, and vanished again. That absence was louder than any confession. From a crime story perspective, this is the most dangerous phase, the aftermath of truth. When lies collapse, violence often follows. When hidden systems are exposed, they react. The man's survival was no longer just his own concern, it had become evidence, leverage, and liability all at once. Authorities were left with an impossible task: protect someone they couldn't reach, investigate a crime that might not yet have occurred, and undo a legal death without triggering further harm. Every move risked alerting the wrong people. Every delay risked losing him forever. Underscores a brutal reality of crime: survival does not guarantee freedom. Sometimes, being alive is the most dangerous condition of all. The CCTV proved he existed, but it did not guarantee that he would be allowed to continue existing. And in that uncertainty, the case reaches its darkest point, where truth is visible, danger is active, and time is running out. The story to its most unsettling realization: not every crime ends with justice, and not every truth leads to closure. In some cases, survival itself becomes the mystery, and disappearance becomes the final statement. After the CCTV revelation, after the frantic reopening of files and silent operations, the man did not return to public life. He did not reclaim his name. He did not step forward to correct the record. Instead, he faded again, this time by choice or by force, no one could say for certain. What haunted investigators most was the absence of an ending. Crime narratives condition us to expect resolution: an arrest, a confession, a rescue, or at least a body. But this case denied all of that. The man existed long enough to disprove his own death, and then vanished back into uncertainty. That alone transformed the story from a procedural failure into a psychological enigma. Authorities were left with fragments instead of answers. The CCTV footage proved life, but not intent. Financial traces suggested careful control: no sudden withdrawals, no reckless movement. Phone data hinted at minimal contact, possibly routed through intermediaries or disposable devices. Whoever he was after being declared dead, he was no longer living as the man he used to be. Identity, in this case, had become optional. The most disturbing question lingered: did he disappear because he wanted to, or because he had to? If his original death had been a mistake, why didn't he resurface once the truth emerged? And if it had been intentional, what danger was so severe that remaining legally dead was safer than reclaiming life? Crime stories thrive in motive, and here the motive was buried deeper than any crime scene. Investigators eventually had to accept a painful truth: some cases cannot be forced into conclusions. Without cooperation, without new sightings, without direct communication, the man became untraceable. Not missing, not dead, simply unreachable. And that state is one of the most dangerous in criminal investigations, because it exists beyond jurisdiction, beyond certainty, beyond closure. The justice system is built to respond, not to chase ghosts. Once a person steps outside every system, legal, financial, digital, they become invisible by design. And invisibility can be either a shield or a sentence. From a crime story perspective, this ending is chilling because it mirrors real life. Not every victim is saved. Not every error is corrected. Sometimes the truth surfaces only long enough to remind us of what we missed, and then disappears forever. The man's survival didn't rewrite the past, it only proved how easily the present can lie. The case stands as a warning. Declarations are not truths. Paperwork is not proof. And absence does not always mean death. Somewhere between being declared dead and being proven alive, a man slipped out of reach, leaving behind a story that refuses to end, and a question that will never stop haunting those who believe the file was closed. In the end, this case forces us to confront one of the most uncomfortable truths in crime history: reality does not always follow rules, procedures, or expectations. A man was officially declared dead, mourned, recorded, and forgotten, until a single piece of footage shattered that certainty. One silent moment on a CCTV screen exposed how fragile official truth can be, and how easily an entire system can be misled by assumptions, paperwork, and the absence of questions. And sometimes, the scariest truth is not that someone died, but that they lived, and chose to disappear.